Grace Carter was gone. No goodbye. No suitcase. No note. Only an untouched envelope containing an entire week's wages resting neatly on the small wooden table beneath her attic window. Damien Moretti stood silently in the doorway of the tiny attic room while every servant in the hallway waited for him to explode. Instead, he said only 4 words. Search the entire estate. Within seconds, armed guards swept through every corridor, cellar, rooftop, greenhouse, service tunnel, and locked gate. Security footage was reviewed. Vehicles were inspected. Every employee was questioned. Nothing. It was as if Grace Carter had disappeared between one heartbeat and the next. The chief of security returned first. No sign of forced entry, sir. Another guard stepped forward. No one saw her leave. The elderly housekeeper lowered her eyes before quietly adding, she left her wages behind. The hallway fell silent. Every servant knew Grace counted every dollar. She would never willingly abandon an entire week's pay. Damien walked into the room alone. The bed had been made with impossible precision. Her uniform had been washed, pressed, and folded into a perfect square. The tiny wooden chair remained tucked beneath the window exactly where it had always been. Nothing looked disturbed. Everything looked finished. He picked up the unopened envelope, weighed it once in his hand, then placed it back exactly where she had left it. Seal this room, he said. His chief frowned. Sir, should we prepare it for the next maid? Damien looked at him without anger. There will be no next maid. The answer spread through the hallway faster than any shouted command. In the Moretti estate, servants who resigned were replaced before sunset and forgotten before dawn. Their names disappeared from the schedule, their rooms were emptied, and life continued without hesitation. Yet Damien stepped outside, closed Grace's bedroom door himself, and handed the key back to the housekeeper. No one enters. Everything stays exactly where it is until Grace Carter chooses to return. No one questioned him. They simply watched the most feared mafia boss in the city preserve the room of a missing maid. Instead of erasing every trace she had ever existed. By noon, the mansion had already begun falling apart in ways no one expected. Fresh flowers never appeared in the entrance hall. The library curtains remained closed long after sunrise. The old shepherd refused to leave the kitchen door, staring toward the empty service entrance as though waiting for familiar footsteps. An elderly cook stood frozen over Damien's lunch tray before quietly whispering, Sir. Grace always reminded me to use less salt whenever your headaches came back. Damien looked down at the untouched bowl for several seconds before answering. Cook it the way she would. It was the closest thing anyone had ever heard him say to gratitude. That evening, Damien entered his study alone. A porcelain cup of tea waited on the corner of his desk exactly where it had appeared every night for the past 3 years. He reached for it, then paused. There was no neatly folded linen beneath the cup. No faint fingerprint on the handle where Grace always turned it toward his right hand. No quiet footsteps fading beyond the half-open door. For the first time, Damien realized those small routines had never belonged to the house. They had belonged to one quiet woman everyone had mistaken for a shadow. A knock interrupted the silence. His chief of security entered carrying a personnel file. If she left willingly, we can hire another maid tomorrow and restore normal operations. Damien never opened the folder. He closed it gently and placed it back into the man's hands. Normal ended the moment Grace disappeared. Later that night, he carried the untouched envelope upstairs himself and laid it carefully back on Grace's neatly made bed. He stood there for a long moment, looking around the tiny attic room that somehow felt emptier than the entire mansion below. Then he quietly turned off the light, closed the door, and locked it himself. Before walking away, he gave one final order. Leave this room exactly as she left it, until Grace Carter walks back through that door. By sunrise, every servant in the Moretti estate knew the impossible had happened. The most feared mafia boss in the city had chosen to preserve an empty maid's room instead of replacing her. None of them yet understood why. Neither did Damien. The order remained unchanged. Grace Carter's room stayed untouched, her wages still resting on the neatly made bed, and every servant walked past the closed door as though disturbing the silence itself had become forbidden. At first, resentment spread faster than concern. A young footman muttered that no maid deserved an empty room while new workers slept two to a space. An older housekeeper answered only by straightening the folded blanket Grace had left behind before quietly closing the door again. Damien heard the disagreement without interrupting it. Instead, he gave one instruction. If anyone wishes to leave this house, they leave with respect. No one disappears as if they never mattered. The words unsettled the staff more than anger ever could. They had served a feared mafia boss for years. Compassion was not part of the routine they understood. Yet neither was the strange absence that now shaped every hallway. Dinner arrived late because no one remembered how Grace organized the kitchen without ever giving orders. Fresh flowers withered in empty vases because no one knew she replaced them before dawn. Damien noticed every missing detail but corrected none himself. He simply watched. For the first time, he realized the estate had relied on countless quiet decisions made by someone everyone had overlooked. The realization carried an uncomfortable weight. The next morning, the elderly cook hesitated outside Damien's study with a tray. The tea was brewed correctly, but the cup rested on the wrong side of the desk. Damien looked at it for a long moment before moving it back to the familiar corner himself. The old woman lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir." "You're not replacing Grace," he answered calmly. "You're helping this house remember her work." It was a small correction, yet the cook's shoulders eased instead of shrinking. Across the room, Damien noticed a faded cloth folded beneath the teapot. The stitching was uneven, repaired by hand more than once. He recognized it without knowing why. Grace had always placed that same cloth under the cup, never allowing the hot porcelain to leave a mark on the old walnut desk. No one had asked her to. The habit suddenly felt less like routine and more like quiet respect for something that belonged to another person. He folded the cloth carefully and left it exactly where she always had. By afternoon, his chief of security returned. "We can clear her records, hire someone new, and restore normal operations." Damien looked through the study window instead of answering immediately. "Normal," he repeated softly. The word sounded strangely hollow. He finally turned back. "Every employee who worked beside Grace will be interviewed, not to question them, but to learn what she carried that we ignored." The security chief frowned. "That will slow everything down." "Then we slow down." The decision cost him efficiency, invited criticism from his own organization, and challenged the unspoken rule that servants remained invisible. Yet he accepted every consequence without raising his voice. As orders spread through the estate, each servant realized something had changed forever. Grace's disappearance was no longer treated as a resignation. It had become a responsibility, and Damien had chosen to bear it himself, opening the first fragile path toward discovering the value of the woman he had never truly seen. The first interview lasted less than 4 minutes before Damien stopped asking questions and started listening. The gardener had found Grace outside before dawn during a winter freeze, wrapping burlap around the youngest rose trees because the heating pipes had failed. She had never reported the damage. She had carried buckets from the kitchen until her palms split, then cleaned the mud before anyone woke. "Why didn't she tell me?" Damien asked. The gardener looked at his cap. "She said you had enough people bringing you problems." The answer changed the room. Damien ordered the pipes repaired, then doubled the gardener's winter budget, not as charity, but because Grace had seen a responsibility his own managers had ignored. That decision exposed another absence. The household accounts showed small purchases Grace had paid for herself, medicine for the cook, non-slip shoes for an aging porter, a replacement lock for a maid who feared walking to her quarters alone. None were expensive. Together, they had consumed nearly half her wages. Damien's thumb rested against the edge of the ledger. He did not praise her. He asked why no supervisor had noticed. By noon, every department head had been called in. Resentment rose when he required them to explain the needs of the people beneath them, not merely their expenses. His chief steward objected that Grace had overstepped her position. Damien closed the ledger. No. She stepped into ours. Yet respect did not erase doubt. Grace had concealed problems, bypassed authority, and made herself responsible for burdens she could not afford. Her kindness had protected others, but it had also allowed the estate's failures to remain invisible. Damien ordered the staff reimbursements issued in her name, then refused to remove the amounts from her record. She made these choices, he said. We will honor them, not rewrite them. The final interview belonged to the night guard. Months earlier, he had nearly lost his job after falling asleep at his post while caring for a sick daughter. Grace had found him first. She brought coffee, finished polishing the silver beside the security desk, and woke him before inspection. Then she made him promise to request the morning shift. She could have used it against me, he said. She didn't. Damien glanced toward the faded cloth beneath his teacup. One corner carried a tiny brown stain he had always assumed was age. The guard quietly explained that Grace had burned her hand catching the cup the night Damien collapsed from exhaustion. She had steadied the tray, called the physician, and left before he opened his eyes. Damien lifted the cloth, then folded it with unusual care. Find every duty she performed that was never assigned to her, he told his security chief. And give me access to the service corridors she used. The man hesitated. Those passages connected private rooms, kitchens, offices, and guarded entrances. Opening them meant exposing weaknesses in the estate's security. Damien placed the cloth inside his coat. She already knew every weakness, he said. The difference is, she used them to protect people. By sunset, he had granted an absent maid something no servant had ever received in the Moretti house, his trust inside the walls he guarded most closely. And somewhere within those walls waited the first proof of how often Grace had stood between him and dangers he had never seen. The service corridor behind Damien's study opened with a key Grace had never been authorized to carry. Damien found no sign of theft inside, only a narrow passage lined with heating pipes, old wiring, and doors that led toward rooms no servant was supposed to enter. His security chief reached for the nearest handle. Damien stopped him. We follow her path. We don't tear through it. The distinction cost them time, but it preserved the one thing Grace had guarded even in secret, other people's dignity. They moved through the corridor slowly. A loose floorboard had been secured with folded cloth so the night staff would not trip. A leaking valve had been wrapped before it could damage the nursery below. Beside a locked records room, Grace had placed a small tin where workers left anonymous requests for medicine, schedule changes, or help they were too afraid to ask for openly. She had stepped into Damien's hidden world without claiming any part of his authority. She had simply accepted the burdens his rules had taught others to conceal. At the final door, Damien found the same uneven stitching as the cloth beneath his teacup. A strip of fabric had been tied around the latch to keep it from closing too loudly near his bedroom. His hand remained on it longer than necessary. Then he opened the door into Grace's attic room. The bed was made. Her uniform was folded. Her wages remained unopened. There was no suitcase, no coat missing from its hook, no photograph removed from the wall. She had not packed for another life. She had erased every reason for anyone to follow her. On the desk sat a sealed envelope with Damien's name written in careful block letters. His security chief stepped forward. That may explain everything. Damien did not touch it. Through the thin wall came the voices of two maids arguing below. One insisted Grace must have betrayed them. The other said Grace had taken extra shifts so a frightened kitchen girl could visit her sick mother without losing her position. Damien looked again at the envelope. Opening it might give him answers. It might also turn Grace's final private choice into something he took simply because he could. He ordered everyone out. For several seconds, the most powerful man in the city stood alone inside a room smaller than his dressing closet, staring at the life of a woman who had carried pieces of his household without ever asking to be seen. Then he removed the master key from his ring and placed it beside her untouched wages. "Seal this room," he said when he stepped into the hall. "Only Grace opens that letter, or I do it with her permission." The decision closed his fastest path to the truth. It also placed her right to choose above his need for control. Before the door shut, Damien took the faded cloth from his coat and laid it beside the envelope, returning the first kindness he finally understood. From that moment on, finding Grace was no longer an investigation. It was a promise he had chosen to keep without knowing whether she would ever trust him enough to come home. Damien left Grace's room sealed exactly as he had promised, but promises did not stop consequences from finding him. Before sunrise, his security chief entered the study carrying a thin folder recovered from the service corridors. It was not Grace's letter. It was a maintenance log written in several different hands, with Grace's careful notes squeezed into the margins. Beside dates of repaired locks and leaking pipes were short reminders: rotate the east gate guard. He hasn't slept. Check the nursery heater before the storm. Move the evening delivery 15 minutes earlier. None of the notes mentioned danger. None claimed credit. Yet every recommendation matched an incident that never became a crisis. Damien slowly realized the estate had been safer not because his security system was flawless, but because one quiet maid had noticed the human weaknesses no report ever recorded. The revelation settled over the room with unbearable weight. Grace had never tried to change his authority. She had protected the people carrying it. His chief of security broke the silence. She should have reported everything through proper channels. Damien looked at the worn notebook again. Would anyone have listened? No one answered. That question changed more than the notebook ever could. The same rules Damien believed created order had quietly taught the weakest people to stay invisible until Grace chose to see them anyway. Later that afternoon, the elderly cook placed a fresh cup of tea on his desk. She reached for the familiar faded cloth, then hesitated when she realized it was gone. Without a word, Damien unfolded the cloth he had left beside Grace's sealed letter the night before and placed it beneath the cup himself. For the first time, the small ritual no longer reminded him of good service. It reminded him that someone had protected his ordinary days so faithfully he had mistaken that protection for normal life. A knock interrupted the silence. The security chief returned with troubling news. Two longtime suppliers insisted on replacing several trusted household workers immediately, claiming recent disruptions threatened the estate's reputation. It sounded reasonable. It would also erase every person Grace had quietly supported before anyone understood why they mattered. Damien studied the list, then pushed it aside. No dismissals. Sir, keeping everyone slows operations. Then we accept slower operations. It was a costly decision. Loyal allies questioned his judgment. Managers warned discipline would weaken. Yet removing those people would mean returning to the same blindness that had allowed Grace to disappear without anyone truly seeing her. That evening, Damien climbed once more to the attic door but stopped before unlocking it. His hand rested lightly against the wood. He did not ask for answers. He simply spoke softly enough that only the empty room could hear. Wherever you are, your people are still safe. Then he turned away without opening the letter, surrendering certainty for the second time because protecting Grace's choices had become more important than satisfying his own need to know. In that quiet decision, the truth changed forever. Damien was no longer searching for the maid who had vanished. He was trying to become the man she had believed he could be, even if finding her demanded sacrificing the unquestioned control that had once defined his entire world. Damien gave up the one advantage that had always kept his enemies cautious: uncertainty. By noon, every trusted captain in the Moretti organization had Grace Carter's name, photograph, and last known movements. Not as a target. As a person under his protection. The order traveled fast, and with it came the cost. Men who had never been allowed to question his private life now knew the quiet Maid mattered enough to change his priorities. One captain warned him that rival families would notice. Damien removed the signet ring that marked his authority and placed it on the table between them. Then let them notice what I am willing to protect. He authorized searches of safe houses, clinics, bus depots, and church shelters, but forbade intimidation. No doors forced. No frightened workers threatened. No woman matching Grace's description detained against her will. The limits slowed the search and angered men accustomed to faster methods. Damien accepted both. By evening, a lead surfaced from a neighborhood pharmacy. Grace had purchased medicine there days before vanishing, then asked the pharmacist to deliver the receipt to no one. Damien could have taken the security footage by force. Instead, he waited while the pharmacist closed the shop and called her lawyer. The delay cost them 3 hours. It also earned one trembling sentence: Grace had been coughing into a handkerchief when she came in, and she had refused the stronger prescription because it was too expensive. Damien's hand tightened around the faded cloth in his pocket. He released it before the pharmacist noticed. Did she say where she was going? The woman shook her head. Only that someone else needed the money more. The answer offered no location, only a deeper wound. Grace had left sick, nearly penniless, and still protecting someone Damien could not see. His security chief urged him to freeze her bank account so any transaction would reveal her. Damien looked at Grace's untouched wages, now sealed inside a case on his desk. Freezing the account might find her. It would also take away the last piece of freedom she still controlled. No, he said. We trace nothing she did not choose to leave behind. The chief stared at him. Then we may lose her. Damien's voice faltered for the first time. Then we lose time. Not her dignity. The next report came before midnight. 2 suppliers had withdrawn cooperation, frightened by rumors that Damien's judgment had softened. A rival crew had begun asking questions about the missing maid. The search itself had made Grace more vulnerable. Damien dismissed half his public security detail and reassigned them to protect every worker she had helped, leaving his own movements exposed. Then he stood before men who had obeyed him out of fear for years and asked for something fear could not command. Find her, he said quietly. Not for me. Find her because she spent years saving people who never learned her name. No one moved until he lowered his head. The gesture lasted only a second, but it changed the room forever. By dawn, the entire Moretti network was searching for Grace under rules that made them slower, weaker, and more human. Then the first consequence arrived: someone else found her trail before they did, and used Damien's promise of protection to draw her farther from the only people now willing to pay any price to bring her home. Grace followed the false promise because it carried the name of someone she had once protected. The message said the frightened kitchen girl needed help, that Damien's search had placed her family in danger, and that only Grace could keep them safe by coming alone. She chose the girl over her own safety before dawn. By the time she realized the address was wrong, the door had already closed behind her. The person waiting inside was not a rival. It was Thomas Vale, the night guard whose job Grace had saved months earlier. He could not meet her eyes. His daughter's hospital bills had been paid by men who now demanded Grace in return. I tried to warn you, he said, his hands shaking around the key. Grace looked past him toward the unlocked back exit. He had left her a choice. Escape, and his daughter would lose the treatment keeping her alive. Stay, and Damien's enemies would use her to break the man who had finally begun protecting the people she loved. Grace moved away from the exit. "Lock it," she said. Thomas's face collapsed. "He'll think I betrayed him." "Then let him." She placed her small bottle of medicine on the table because her fingers had started trembling. Even now, she refused to make another person carry her fear. Across the city, Damien learned who had taken her. His captains demanded permission to seize Thomas's family and force an exchange. It would have worked. The old Damien would have given the order before the sentence ended. Instead, he removed every armed man from the hospital where Thomas's daughter lay and placed 2 unmarked guards outside only to keep her safe. "No one uses a child," he said. The choice destroyed his strongest leverage. It also told Grace's captors exactly how far he had changed. They sent him a recording. Grace sat beneath a bare light, pale but upright, while Thomas stood behind her unable to look at the camera. She did not beg Damien to come. She asked him to protect the workers at the estate and not punish Thomas. Damien watched the recording twice. On the third viewing, he noticed a faded cloth folded beneath the glass of water beside her hand. Grace had taken it from her room before vanishing. The same cloth that had once protected his desk now covered the cold metal table between her and the man who had betrayed her. She had carried his returned kindness with her. Damien closed his eyes, then made the sacrifice that ended the rule of fear holding his world together. He sent every rival family a signed statement surrendering control of the waterfront routes they had contested for years, on one condition: Grace Carter and Thomas Vale walked free, and Thomas's daughter remained untouched. His council called it weakness. His allies called it surrender. Damien signed anyway. "She is not the price of my power." The agreement cost him territory, loyalty, and the reputation that had protected him since he was young. Hours later, Thomas received confirmation that his daughter was safe. He opened Grace's door but remained in the hallway, knowing he could never ask forgiveness. Grace paused beside him. Then she placed the medicine bottle in his palm for the child and walked away without condemnation. Outside, Damien waited alone, unarmed, honoring her right to choose whether to approach him. Grace stopped several feet away. He did not reach for her. "You gave up everything," she whispered. Damien looked at the cloth in her hand. "Not everything." But Grace did not step closer. Saving her had exposed the truth neither of them could escape. She mattered enough to change his entire world, and that world might never forgive either of them for it. Grace did not move toward him, and Damien did not ask her to. He stood in the cold with his hands open at his sides while the men who once feared his name watched from a distance. "I can take you somewhere safe," he said. Grace's fingers tightened around the faded cloth. Safe for whom? The question stopped him. Every protection he had offered carried his authority inside it. Every room, guard, and order still belonged to his world. He lowered his gaze, then removed the master key from his pocket, the same key he had left beside her wages, and placed it on the pavement between them. "Then you choose the door." Grace looked at the key but did not pick it up. "I won't return as your maid." Damien's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the effort of surrendering the answer he wanted. "Then don't." The words cost him more than the waterfront routes. They released the only role that had kept her near him. Hours later, Grace entered the Moretti estate through the front door for the first time. No uniform. No tray in her hands. Every servant stood silent as she climbed to the attic, unlocked her room herself, and found everything exactly where she had left it: the unopened wages, the sealed letter, and the cloth Damien had returned. He remained outside the doorway. She opened the letter alone. There was no confession inside. Only one sentence in her careful handwriting: "Please notice them before they disappear too." Damien read it only after she held it out to him. The truth did not accuse him of failing to see her. It revealed that her silence had never been weakness. She had stayed quiet because speaking for herself might have cost her the chance to protect everyone else. Every cup of tea, repaired lock, changed schedule, and hidden act of kindness had been a choice to preserve another person's dignity inside a house built on obedience. Damien folded the letter once. Then he walked downstairs, gathered the entire household, and removed the Moretti rule that had governed the estate for generations. No servant would remain invisible. Every worker could report danger without permission, refuse unsafe orders, and leave with full wages and protection. His council objected. Several captains walked out. Damien let them go. The power he lost did not return, and Grace's trust did not heal simply because he had finally understood her. When the hall emptied, he found her beside his study door holding the master key. She offered it back. Damien closed her fingers around it instead. "Not mine," he said. "Yours, until you decide otherwise." Grace's eyes filled, but she still did not step closer. So Damien did the one thing the man he had been could never have done. He lowered himself to one knee, not to claim her, not to beg for forgiveness, but to place himself beneath her choice. "Come back only if you can remain free." Grace looked at the tea cooling on his desk, then at the key in her hand. The house was no longer waiting for its maid. It was waiting to learn whether the woman who had changed it could ever choose to stay. Grace left the study carrying the master key, but she did not unlock a single door that day. Instead, she walked through the estate exactly as she once had, quietly, patiently, noticing what others hurried past. A young maid struggled to lift a crate of linens. Before Grace reached her, the elderly cook set down her own basket and helped without being asked. The gardener covered the roses before the evening frost. The porter paused to ask a frightened new servant if she wanted someone to walk her to the gate after sunset. Grace stopped in the hallway, watching the smallest acts ripple outward. No one announced a new rule. They simply remembered how one quiet woman had treated them, and chose to do the same for someone else. Upstairs, Damien stood alone in his study. The tea waited on the corner of his desk, growing cool as always. This time he did not look toward the doorway expecting footsteps. He simply waited. When Grace finally appeared, she knocked before entering. Not because she had to, but because it was still her choice. Damien rose without speaking. He did not offer her a position. He did not ask where she had been. He only moved aside, leaving enough space for her either to stay or to leave again. Grace crossed the room carrying the faded cloth. She placed it beneath the teacup with the same careful hands that had done so for years, then gently turned the handle toward him. It was never about protecting the desk. It had always been about noticing the person who would reach for the cup after another impossible day. Damien looked at the cloth, then at Grace. For the first time since they met, he accepted the kindness without believing he owned the person offering it. He lifted the cup, took a quiet sip, and asked only one question. "Will you help me keep seeing them?" Grace smiled through tired eyes. "Only if you promise to notice them before I do." He nodded. No oath. No contract. Just a choice the man from the beginning of this story could never have made. Months later, the attic room remained exactly as it had always been, except its door was never locked again. It belonged to Grace only for as long as she wanted it. Sometimes she slept there. Sometimes she spent weeks away helping families the estate now quietly supported. She always returned because returning had become freedom instead of obligation. The waterfront Damien surrendered never came back. Some allies never forgave him. His influence shrank, but the fear surrounding his name faded with it. In its place grew something slower and harder to earn, trust. One rainy evening, a frightened new servant entered the mansion carrying a single worn suitcase. She froze at the enormous front hall, unsure whether she belonged. Before anyone else could speak, Grace stepped forward, took the suitcase from her trembling hand, and walked beside her instead of ahead. Damien watched from the staircase but stayed where he was. He no longer needed to control the moment to protect it. On his desk, a cup of tea waited on the faded cloth. This time, it never had the chance to grow cold.